In 2013, Rachel Turner's life was a fragile balancing act. At 34, she had already faced more hardship than most. Raised in a small town near Montgomery, Alabama, she fell into the wrong crowd in her early 20s, which led to a spiral of drug use and petty theft. Her criminal record included multiple charges, the worst of which saw her serve time for drug possession. That experience had deeply scarred her, but it also pushed her to change. She knew she had to clean up her life, not just for herself, but for her two children, 14-year-old Lily and 9-year-old Max. The road to redemption was difficult. After serving time in jail and completing rehabilitation, Rachel returned to Montgomery, determined to create a stable home for her children. Her husband, Greg, worked tirelessly as a mechanic at a local garage. The long hours and the physical toll of his job meant that he was often absent, leaving Rachel to handle the day-to-day responsibilities of raising their children and managing their modest home. The pressure of rebuilding her life weighed heavily on her, but she was resolute. Rachel's past made it hard for her to find work. Many potential employers saw her criminal record as a red flag, and doors continued to close in her face. To cope, she sought out community support, and that's when she found the local Baptist church. It was a small but tight-knit congregation led by Pastor Jonathan Reed, a charismatic man in his early 50s. He was a figure of authority in Montgomery, known for his fiery sermons, community outreach, and work with troubled families. He presented himself as a shepherd of lost souls, and to Rachel, it seemed like the perfect place to find spiritual healing and redemption. At first, the church felt like a haven for Rachel. Pastor Reed welcomed her warmly, offering her private counseling sessions where he emphasized forgiveness and the opportunity for a fresh start. He spoke with authority, but also a gentleness that Rachel desperately needed. The church became a safe place for her, a retreat from the harsh realities of her life, and Pastor Reed became a mentor she looked up to. He knew about her past, but instead of judgment, he offered what appeared to be unconditional support. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was on the right path. She became deeply involved in the church, volunteering for events and attending every Sunday service with her children. Lily and Max also started attending the church's youth programs, which gave Rachel some much-needed time to herself. As Rachel's involvement in the church deepened, so did Pastor Reed's hold over her. At first, his attention seemed benign, even helpful. He had always been a charismatic and authoritative figure in the church, and for Rachel, still seeking redemption and forgiveness for her past, his guidance felt essential. Reed regularly offered her private counseling sessions, framing them as spiritual mentorship. Rachel, still fragile from her journey out of addiction and legal troubles, believed that he was invested in her personal growth and recovery. However, beneath Reed's facade of compassion lurked something far darker. Over time, his behavior became more controlling. He asked increasingly invasive questions about her past, subtly prying into details about her criminal record, her struggles with addiction, and her relationships with her husband and children. Rachel, eager to rebuild her life, shared more than she probably should have, trusting Reed's promise of discretion. But what she didn't realize was that Reed was storing every piece of information like a weapon, waiting for the right moment to use it against her. It was after a church fundraiser one evening when the dynamic shifted irrevocably. As the rest of the congregation trickled out, Reed asked Rachel to stay behind and help clean up. She didn't think anything of it at first. It wasn't unusual for Reed to ask her for help with church duties. But once they were alone in his office, the atmosphere changed. Reed's tone became colder, more calculated. He began to talk about her criminal record, bringing up details she had shared with him in confidence. At first, his comments seemed offhand, but as he continued, it became clear that he was holding her past over her head. "You've come a long way," he said, leaning against his desk, his eyes dark and predatory. "But you know, it wouldn't take much for everything to fall apart again. People in this town, they're quick to judge. The law, too. If the wrong people knew about your past, it could make things complicated." Rachel's heart raced as his meaning became clear. She felt a sickening sense of dread creep over her. Reed wasn't just reminding her of her past, he was threatening her. She tried to stand her ground, reminding him that she had paid for her mistakes, that she was working hard to be a better mother, a better person. But Reed's expression never wavered. He began to hint at his connections, people in law enforcement, other community leaders, people who could make life difficult for her again. He painted a picture of how easily her life could spiral back into chaos. And then he delivered his ultimatum. "If you want to protect your family, you'll do what I ask," he said, his voice low and cold. Rachel was trapped. She knew that Reed's influence in the community was powerful. If he wanted to ruin her life, he could, and she couldn't risk it. The thought of losing her children, of going back to jail, terrified her. Reed's demand was sickeningly clear. He wanted her in a sexual relationship, and he would use her fear of exposure and her vulnerability as leverage. In that moment, Rachel realized she had no one to turn to. She couldn't tell her husband, Greg. He would never understand, and even if he did, what could he do against a man like Pastor Reed? The church had become her lifeline, and now it was her prison. That night, Rachel made the gut-wrenching decision to comply with Reed's demands, believing she had no other choice. Over the following weeks, their secret affair began in the shadows of the church. Reed controlled every aspect of their encounters, where they met, how they communicated, when it would happen. He isolated Rachel, ensuring that she would be too afraid to speak out, too trapped by the threat of exposure to escape. The guilt Rachel felt was unbearable. She couldn't look her husband in the eye anymore. The weight of her secret made it impossible to find peace, even in her own home. Every time she was with Reed, she felt disgusted with herself, but the fear of what he might do kept her silent. She tried to put on a brave face for Lily and Max, but the strain began to show. Reed, sensing her internal struggle, only tightened his grip. He reminded her constantly of the consequences if she didn't keep quiet, if she didn't follow his demands. The once charismatic pastor who had offered her redemption had now become her tormentor. For Rachel, every day became a waking nightmare. She was living a double life, one where she was a devoted mother and wife trying to rebuild her family, and another where she was trapped in a web of coercion and manipulation by the very man she had trusted to help her. Pastor Reed's dark demands were only the beginning of a twisted game of control, and Rachel, suffocated by fear, felt like there was no escape. As the weeks stretched into months, Rachel found herself further entangled in the twisted relationship with Pastor Reed. His power over her was absolute, built on the foundation of fear and manipulation. Every day, Rachel was reminded of how fragile her life had become, living under the constant threat that her past would be exposed, and her family torn apart if she didn't comply with Reed's demands. Despite her attempts to compartmentalize the shame and guilt, the pressure was suffocating, consuming every part of her life. Reed, growing more confident in his control, began to push the boundaries of their secret meetings. No longer content with the privacy of their previous encounters, he started demanding to see her at riskier times and locations. He'd call her late at night, insisting she meet him at the church, or even in places where they risked being seen by other members of the congregation. The fear of discovery loomed over Rachel like a dark cloud, but she felt powerless to resist. Each time she tried to distance herself, Reed's threats would pull her back in, reminding her of how quickly her life could unravel. At home, Rachel's mental and emotional state deteriorated. She struggled to function as a mother and wife, haunted by the secrets she carried. Her husband, Greg, began to notice the changes in her. She was more distant, frequently distracted, and prone to sudden emotional outbursts. He would often ask if something was wrong, his concern genuine, but Rachel, terrified of the truth coming out, lied to him. She blamed the stress of their financial situation, her difficulty finding work, and the challenges of raising their children, especially Lily, who had begun exhibiting typical teenage rebellion. Greg accepted her excuses, but his patience was wearing thin. Despite her efforts to keep the darkness from touching her children, Rachel's relationship with them also began to suffer. Lily, in particular, felt the distance between her and her mother. The once close bond they had shared was now strained by Rachel's emotional absence. Max, younger and less aware of the tension, still sensed the change in the atmosphere at home. The household was no longer a place of comfort and stability, but rather a fragile structure held together by Rachel's silence. Then came the day that changed everything. Rachel arrived at the church for one of her scheduled meetings with Reed, dreading what had become an unbearable routine. She had grown used to the pattern of Reed's manipulation, his control over her life and body, but she wasn't prepared for what he would ask next. In his office, Reed's demeanor was different, more assertive, more predatory. After a few moments of small talk meant to further disarm Rachel, Reed made his demand. He no longer wanted just her compliance, he wanted more. With a chilling calmness, he suggested that it was time for Rachel to bring her daughter Lily to him. He framed the demand as though he were doing Rachel and her family a favor, implying that Lily could benefit from the same guidance he had provided Rachel. The insinuation was clear, and it horrified Rachel to her core. Her heart pounded in her chest as the full weight of what Reed was asking crashed over her. For a moment, she was paralyzed by fear and disbelief. She had endured the degradation and control for months, believing that if she complied, she could protect her family. But now Reed had crossed a line that shattered any remaining illusion of control. This wasn't just about her anymore. He was threatening to involve her innocent daughter. In a rare moment of defiance, Rachel refused. She told Reed there was no way she would ever involve Lily, but Reed, as always, had the upper hand. He reminded Rachel of the consequences of defiance, the destruction of her family, the loss of her children, her past crimes laid bare for the world to see. He painted a terrifying picture of what life would look like if she didn't comply. Reed's threats were no longer just about Rachel's future, but Lily's as well. Rachel left the church that day in a state of shock, her mind racing as she replayed Reed's words over and over again. She had never felt more trapped, more powerless. The shame of the affair had been unbearable, but the idea of involving her daughter in Reed's twisted games filled her with a rage she had never known before. She had been willing to sacrifice herself to protect her family, but now the stakes had been raised beyond anything she could have imagined. The emotional toll of keeping Reed's secret had already pushed Rachel to her limits, but now faced with the impossible choice of protecting her daughter or submitting to Reed's demands once again, Rachel found herself on the edge of a breakdown. She knew she couldn't continue living like this, but she couldn't see a way out. Every avenue seemed blocked, and Reed's control seemed insurmountable. Rachel's refusal to comply with Pastor Reed's grotesque demand sent her spiraling into a psychological nightmare. Fear for her daughter Lily consumed her every waking moment. She knew Reed was relentless, and her imagination ran wild with terrifying scenarios in which Reed found a way to manipulate or coerce her daughter without Rachel being able to stop it. Her life, once a fragile balance of secrecy and shame, was now ruled by paranoia and dread. The constant stress began to wear Rachel down physically and emotionally. She lost weight, barely ate, and found herself staying up late into the night, obsessively checking on Lily. Every time the phone rang or a car passed by, Rachel's heart pounded with fear that Reed was one step closer to carrying out his threat. She monitored Lily's movements, becoming overprotective in ways that confused and frustrated her daughter. Lily, who had no idea what was happening, grew distant from her mother, confused by Rachel's sudden overbearing nature. Greg, unaware of the dark undercurrents consuming his wife, noticed the dramatic change in Rachel's behavior. She was distant, her moods unpredictable, and she often seemed distracted during their rare family dinners. Greg asked Rachel what was wrong, but every time she brushed him off with vague explanations about stress or her struggle to find a job. The mounting tension in their home became palpable. Greg, though concerned, was working longer hours to support the family and believed that whatever was troubling Rachel would pass in time. But Rachel knew otherwise. Her world was falling apart, and she couldn't confide in anyone. Reed's threats held her hostage, paralyzing her with the fear of losing her children and her freedom. The shame of the affair weighed heavily on her conscience, making her feel guilty for betraying Greg, even though she had been coerced into it. The thought of Greg discovering the truth was almost as unbearable as the thought of Reed hurting Lily. She had no one to turn to, no escape from the tightening noose of Reed's control. In her quiet moments, Rachel's mind wandered to darker places. She knew that Reed wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. He had already taken so much from her, and now he wanted her daughter. The thought sickened her, and she began to feel trapped in an inescapable cycle of abuse. She considered going to the police, but fear kept her silent. Fear of Reed's threats, fear of her past being exposed, fear of what Greg and Lily would think of her if they knew what had been happening all these months. Rachel was suffocating under the weight of her secret, and she could no longer see a way out. As Reed's pressure mounted, so did Rachel's anger. At first, it simmered beneath the surface, buried under layers of fear and shame, but slowly it began to build. Each time Reed called or sent a message, demanding to see her, reminding her of his power, Rachel's resentment grew. She resented Reed for exploiting her vulnerability, for destroying the small semblance of stability she had fought so hard to create. She resented herself for not stopping it sooner, for allowing him to manipulate her. But most of all, she feared that if she didn't act soon, she would lose the most precious thing in her life, her daughter. One night after another disturbing call from Reed in which he reiterated his demand to see Lily, something inside Rachel snapped. The panic that had consumed her for so long turned into rage. She realized that she could no longer endure the torment, the manipulation, and the fear. She knew that there was no reasoning with Reed. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and Rachel couldn't allow that to happen. Not to her daughter. Never. In the days that followed, Rachel began to formulate a plan. It wasn't fully conscious at first, just fleeting thoughts, desperate ideas born out of panic. She considered fleeing with her children, disappearing without a trace, but that wouldn't stop Reed from looking for them. He knew too much, had too much power over her life. Running wouldn't solve the problem. She realized that, to end the nightmare once and for all, she had to confront Reed. But this time, it wouldn't be a conversation. This time, Rachel knew she had to do something drastic. Rachel's behavior grew more erratic as her internal struggle intensified. She began preparing for the confrontation. Though no one around her could see the storm brewing, she became obsessed with thoughts of what Reed might do next, imagining him taking control of her life even further, hurting her daughter, or even her son. These thoughts consumed her, and with each passing day, her resolve hardened. The plan became clearer in her mind. Rachel could no longer live in fear. The thought of Reed touching Lily fueled a determination she had never felt before. She would do anything, anything to protect her daughter, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. There was no turning back now. She wasn't sure when, but she knew the confrontation was coming soon. She had played along with Reed's manipulation for too long, and it was time to reclaim her life, to save her children from the nightmare that had consumed her. Rachel was no longer the same woman she had been when she first walked into the church. She was now a mother on the brink, pushed to the very edge by the weight of her fear and shame. There was only one way out, and she was prepared to take it. On a cold, silent evening, Rachel received yet another message from Pastor Reed. The message was more insistent, more chilling than before. It wasn't just a reminder of his control over her. It was a direct threat to her daughter, Lily. Reed demanded that Rachel bring her to him, his words laced with veiled promises of spiritual guidance that made Rachel's skin crawl. Her mind raced. She knew that Reed would never stop, not until he got what he wanted. The thought of Lily falling into his hands filled Rachel with a rage and fear so intense that it blurred her judgment. That night, Rachel made a decision. She couldn't run from Reed anymore. She couldn't wait for him to destroy her family, to violate the most precious thing in her life. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long transformed into something darker, something more powerful. Rage, desperation, the need to protect her daughter at any cost consumed her, and in that moment, Rachel realized what she had to do. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, her hands trembling but determined. The weight of it in her grip was heavy, cold, a stark reminder of what she was about to do. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. It was about ending the nightmare before Reed could harm Lily the way he had harmed her. She couldn't allow him to have that power. Not anymore. Rachel drove to the church in silence, her mind laser-focused on the task ahead. Her breath was shallow, her pulse racing, but there was no turning back. She arrived at the church, its large, dark silhouette looming against the night sky. She knew Reed would be there. He was always there, preparing for his sermons or running late-night meetings. The place that had once symbolized sanctuary and redemption for Rachel now felt like a prison, a place where her spirit had been slowly broken. She parked a short distance from the church, every movement deliberate, her senses heightened. The walk to the door felt like it stretched for miles, every step echoing in her ears. As she entered the building, the familiar scent of old wood and musty carpet filled her nostrils, a sharp contrast to the dread building inside her. She found Reed in his office, seated at his desk, reviewing notes for Sunday's sermon. The glow from a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls, the room dim and silent except for the soft scratch of his pen. He didn't notice her at first, lost in his work, his back to the door. But when Rachel stormed into the room, her face set in stone, he looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Rachel, what are you—" Before he could finish, she slammed the door shut behind her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Reed's eyes flicked to the knife in her hand, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that his grip over her was slipping. The calm authority he usually wielded faltered, replaced by an edge of nervousness. He stood up, trying to assert control, but it was clear Rachel had come with a purpose that he hadn't anticipated. "What do you think you're doing?" Reed's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, his facade of confidence cracking. "You need to calm down. Think about what you're doing." Rachel, her voice tight with fury, responded through gritted teeth. "I'm done thinking. I'm done being afraid. You will never touch my daughter. Ever." Reed's expression darkened. He attempted to regain his footing, leaning into the same manipulative tactics that had worked so well before. He reminded her of her past, of the criminal record he could expose, of the power he still held over her life. But this time, Rachel didn't flinch. His threats, once so terrifying, now seemed hollow. She had nothing left to lose. The confrontation quickly escalated. Reed moved toward her, his voice rising as he tried to intimidate her. But Rachel was beyond fear now. She had endured too much, suffered too long under his control. Years of manipulation, coercion, and humiliation boiled over in a moment of pure, raw rage. Without hesitation, Rachel lunged forward. The knife in her hand moved instinctively, slashing through the air with a force she didn't know she had. Reed, caught off guard, stumbled backward, clutching at the first wound as blood began to stain his shirt. His eyes widened in shock as he tried to grapple with what was happening. But Rachel was relentless. Her hands, slick with sweat and adrenaline, gripped the knife tighter as she plunged it into him again and again, each strike fueled by the terror and anger that had built inside her for so long. The struggle was brief but brutal. Reed fought back, but he was no match for Rachel's desperation. With each stab, she felt the weight of his control lift, the chains that had bound her for so long snapping one by one. When it was over, Reed collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as his lifeblood pooled around him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Rachel's heavy breathing. She stood over him, panting, her chest heaving, the knife still clenched in her trembling hand. Reed's body lay still, the life draining from him in slow, shallow breaths until there was nothing left. His eyes, once so cold and calculating, were now blank, lifeless. Rachel, her body shaking with a mix of horror and relief, dropped the knife to the floor with a dull clatter. The weight of what she had done settled in her chest, but for the first time in months, the fear was gone. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at Reed's lifeless form. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life, who had threatened her family and tormented her for so long, was finally dead. But the reality of the situation quickly set in. The blood on her hands, the body on the floor. There was no undoing what had just happened. She had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Rachel knew she couldn't stay. The church was no longer a place of salvation, but a crime scene. She had to leave, but as she turned toward the door, the enormity of what she had done weighed heavily on her shoulders. The aftermath of Pastor Reed's murder sent shockwaves through the community. Rachel was arrested within hours of the incident. Her blood-stained clothes and the knife at the scene left little doubt about her involvement. She was charged with manslaughter, and though she had acted in a moment of desperation, the weight of her actions felt suffocating. As she sat in the cold, sterile confines of a jail cell, Rachel knew that life as she had known it was over. The investigation into Pastor Reed's life revealed a far darker history than anyone had imagined. During Rachel's trial, the truth about Reed's manipulation and abuse came to light. He had been using his position of power within the church to prey on vulnerable women, blackmailing them under the guise of spiritual guidance. Witnesses from the congregation, some of whom had their own suspicions about Reed, began to come forward. Rachel's legal team argued that she had been pushed to the edge by Reed's relentless coercion and threats to expose her past. The most harrowing revelation, however, was Reed's demand that Rachel bring her daughter, Lily, into his twisted world. Rachel's defense revolved around the trauma she had endured. In court, she appeared as a broken woman who had been pushed beyond the limits of her humanity. She recounted how Reed had manipulated her, threatened her with her criminal past, and destroyed her peace of mind, leading her to the only decision she believed could protect her family: killing him. The details of the abuse painted a grim picture of a predator disguised as a pastor, who had long been hiding his true nature behind the veneer of faith and authority. As the trial progressed, the community around the church began to fracture. Congregants who had once revered Pastor Reed as a spiritual guide were left grappling with the horrific truths being revealed in court. Many questioned how such corruption could have remained hidden for so long. Some members of the church openly condemned the leadership for not recognizing Reed's predatory behavior, while others clung to denial, unable to reconcile the pastor they had known with the monster being described in court. The media seized on the scandal, turning Rachel's case into a national story. Headlines focused on the shocking double life of Pastor Reed and the tragic consequences of his exploitation of power. News outlets followed every detail, portraying Rachel as both a villain and a victim, a mother driven to murder by fear and desperation, trapped in a situation from which she saw no escape. The case exposed not only the darkness within the church, but also the vulnerability of women like Rachel, who had few resources and felt cornered by a system designed to protect men like Reed. As the trial neared its conclusion, public opinion began to shift in Rachel's favor. Many saw her as a victim of a predatory man who had exploited his position for personal gain. Her legal team emphasized the extreme circumstances she had faced, painting Reed as a manipulative figure who had preyed on her vulnerabilities and left her with no other option. While the prosecution argued that Rachel had committed a violent crime, the defense's portrayal of her as a mother trying to protect her daughter from a predator resonated deeply with the jury and the public. In the end, Rachel was convicted of manslaughter, but her sentence was far lighter than expected. The judge acknowledged the abuse she had suffered at the hands of Pastor Reed and took into account the overwhelming psychological pressure that had driven her to act. The courtroom was filled with a mix of relief and somberness as the verdict was read. Rachel, though facing time in prison, knew that she had saved her daughter from a fate worse than her own. The fallout from the trial rippled through the church and the local community. The congregation that once held Pastor Reed in high regard now faced an identity crisis, as many members left the church in disgust, while others remained, trying to rebuild what had been shattered. Church leadership faced intense scrutiny, with several elders resigning amidst accusations that they had failed to see the warning signs of Reed's behavior. For many, the once sacred place of worship had become a symbol of betrayal. Despite her imprisonment, Rachel found a measure of peace in knowing that Lily was safe. She had endured unimaginable torment, but she had also broken free from Reed's control. The price she paid was steep, but in her mind, it was worth it to protect her family. Though she would spend years behind bars, she held on to the belief that she had done what was necessary to stop a man who had inflicted so much harm, not only on her, but on others as well.